Hello. In this video, we are going to speak about the cerebral cortex and the cranial nerves. So this follows the previous one, and it focuses exclusively on these two areas, the cerebral cortex and the cranial nerves. Now recall that the cerebrum has several parts. So the cerebrum, and the first part of that is the top layer that is 4 millimeters thick, and that is called the cortex of the cerebrum. To make it simple, we say the cerebral cortex. Please do not confuse the two, because the cerebral cortex is only part of the cerebrum, and the cerebrum is the whole entire thing that has right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and all other parts that we discussed in the previous video. So the cerebral cortex is what makes the difference between a human being and another animal. It is the most extensive cortex in all animals, and it is the system where we store information that we acquire, and that gives us cognition and language and thought and decision making, and everything that you can think about that makes us human is mediated by the cortex. So you can think about it as a thin pancake, big and wrapped around the entire brain, and it is convoluted into prominent areas that we call gyri. One of them is called gyrus, and the valleys in between are called sulci. One is sulcus, and sometimes we also use the terms fissure, especially if it is very, very deep. A deep groove in the brain is called fissure, and most of them are called sulcus, and a plural is sulci. In most anatomy books that are not specialized, that do not really address the whole thing in detail, they tell you, oh, the brain has 4 lobes. It has more than that. Okay, this is not the brain. This is part of the brain. This is the cerebrum, and it has 4 visible parts. It is divided into 4 visible parts. These divisions are not random. They are divided based on the functions of each one, each lobe, for example. And as you recall, each lobe is covered by a part of the bone of the skull. It gives the name to each one of these. Another thing is that instead of the word lobe, you could also use the word cortex. For example, you have the frontal cortex that includes all of this area, or you can call it the frontal lobe, the parietal cortex or the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe or the occipital lobe or the occipital cortex, and then the temporal lobe or the temporal cortex. And these are all named after the bones that cover them: parietal bone, occipital bone, temporal bone, and frontal bone. So the cortex is divided into 6 main parts, and 2 of them are visible, and 2 are invisible, and 4 of them are visible. So we are going to discuss these and look at the main landmarks of each one and discuss the functions, basic functions of each. But to let you know that you always think about the anatomic name and the functional name. So for example, the occipital lobe is almost exclusively dedicated to visual processing. So you are gonna hear its functional name as, or physiological name as, the visual cortex. The visual cortex. So, for example, this somatosensory cortex, this is a functional name. It is what it does. But we call it a different anatomic name. We call it the post-central gyrus. So we'll discuss this in detail in this video. So these again, the 6 major parts of the cerebral cortex are the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe that you could see on the surface. And now there are other parts that are hidden. One is called the insula, or the insular lobe, insular cortex, and then there's another one that we will show you, called the cingulate gyrus. Cingulate gyrus. So the main functions of the cortex as a whole is to give you all kinds of cognitive functions are mediated by or controlled by the cortex. The language functions, emotional processing functions, sensory functions, motor functions, visual processing functions. So it is what makes us human. Before we get into the details about every part of the cortex and what it has, we are going to look at the boundaries, the boundaries that separate one area from another. And these, we call them fissures, or fissures are the deep ones. And sulci, are the shallow ones. So one of the most important, or the most prominent ones, is that line, that deep groove that separates the right hemisphere from the left hemisphere. It is much deeper than this, but just because the brain here doesn't have anything to support it, it is just flopping down. But the two sit together, the right hemisphere, left hemisphere sit together just like this. And when you open them up, you see that fissure is very deep. So the longitudinal fissure goes from the rostral, the far front end, rostral end of the cerebrum, to the far end at the back, the caudal end, from the rostral end to the caudal end of the cerebrum. Oh, that is all that you need to say if you are asked what is the longitudinal fissure. Be prepared to identify these fissures on pictures and to also explain what they separate. So the longitudinal fissure extends from the rostral end to the caudal end of the cerebrum, and it separates the right hemisphere from the left hemisphere. And so that, if you say that, this is all you need to say about a structural, a landmark like this. Then we have the gyri. These are prominent areas like little hills, and each one has a particular name. The central fissure is, it is on the center of the head, on the center of the brain, and it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. That central fissure here is going to have more than one name. It will have more than one name. It is called the Rolandic fissure, or the fissure of Rolandus. And it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And because it is called central, the frontal gyrus, the gyrus in front of it, anterior to it, is called the precentral gyrus. And the gyrus posterior to it is called the post-central gyrus. These are anatomic names, but the functional names for these are, the functional name for the precentral gyrus is the motor cortex, and the functional name of the posterior the post-central gyrus, that is called the somatosensory cortex or the primary somatosensory cortex. So then we have the so this central fissure, how do we describe it? It is the fissure that extends from the longitudinal fissure superiorly and extends all the way down to the lateral fissure or the sylvian fissure. So and add to this that the central fissure or the Rolandic fissure or Rolandic sulcus, it doesn't matter what you call it, as long as it's one of these. It separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and that's it. Then the fissure that separates the temporal lobe from the anterior and the parietal lobes, that one, when you open it also, it has a deep groove in between. So that is called the temporal fissure, or the sylvian fissure, or the fissure of Sylvius. All of these are names, or one more is the lateral fissure. All of these are names for the same groove that separates the parietal and frontal lobes from the temporal lobe. Then we have the parieto-occipital sulcus, and that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. You get the clue from the name, parietal occipital, or parieto-occipital. This is that boundary between the parietal and the occipital lobes. So now let's look at the 6 major parts of the cerebral cortex. Number 1, the cingulate gyrus, and then the insula, sometimes called the insular cortex. Insula comes from the word hidden or insulated. And then you have the 4 lobes. You have the frontal lobe or the frontal cortex, parietal, temporal, and occipital. And remember again, instead of the word lobe, you can always use the word cortex. Cingulate cortex, insular cortex, or insula. So the cingulate, you are not going to see it from the surface, but it is part of the cerebral cortex. How do you see it? Is when you open the longitudinal fissure between the 2 hemispheres, you open that up, and then you are going to see that gyrus extending from the posterior end of the posterior inferior end of the parietal lobe to all the way down to the prefrontal cortex. This is called the prefrontal cortex, and it goes right above that white structure that is the corpus callosum. That's a different view for the corpus callosum. So it extends all on the it is superior to the corpus callosum and extends again from the parietal lobe all the way to the anterior most part of the prefrontal, to the prefrontal cortex, but it is all around the corpus callosum. The functions include analysis of thought, and also it plays a great role in decision making and and the regulation of mood, and it is also critical for motor planning. There are two areas here in the center of it that interact with these two areas for motor planning. Then the insula or insular cortex, when you open the temporal fissure or or the fissure of sylvius or lateral fissure, you open it up, you're gonna find this area that is buried, covered underneath, and that is the insular cortex. Now, this area is specialized in translating your feelings and emotions into things that you physically can feel. Like when you say someone says something, it felt like was punched in the stomach. That physical sensation that you get as a result of your feelings is made possible by the insular cortex. It contributes to pleasure, the feeling of pleasure. It is also it's a major part of a system called the brain default mechanism, which makes kind of decisions to link memories with your conscious memory. It contributes to speech. It has an extensive connection between it and Broca's area. Broca's area is right above it here, and it has connections with it that contribute to verbal production, to production of speech, and in some cases, if that link is severed, that could lead to mutism. It is also a center for intuition. For example, when you feel, something is going to happen, you see someone walking, so he's going to fall, Didn't I tell you? So I had the intuition. So these intuitions are basically calculated by the insular cortex, and it communicates with various areas of the brain, and it gets like little pieces, bits and pieces, assembles them together into one complete, unit of information that will enable you to make judgment, even though you do not know why that judgment comes true. If your knowledge that you have gathered, through your life is true, then your intuitions will be also accurate. So what makes you think that this person is gonna fall? You are gonna judge based on your own experiences that, he was walking, for example, with imbalance, maybe tilted this way. And as a result, the weight on one foot or one leg is gonna exceed the weight on the other significantly. And the angle here, there, you get all these that will give you the logical conclusion that if you put a body on two legs under these circumstances, that person cannot sustain the movement, that person will fall. So, but if the person doesn't have accurate information, their intuitions will not be always accurate. But anyways, that area that gives you that intuition is the insular cortex. So again, it is involved in motor speech production, and it has direct connections with Broca's area right above it. Now, the areas that cover the insula, all of these areas, especially the part, when you put these together back again, let's see. Here, the angle, the point where the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe meet, this area, these are called the opercula. Operculum means lid, means cover. So they cover the insula. Now these are critical to language functions, whether verbal production or processing. So this little area of that cover is called the parietal operculum. And the area next to it, that's right next to it here from the frontal lobe, that angle of the frontal lobe, that is called the frontal operculum. And the area that is also part of the temporal cortex, we call it the temporal operculum. And like I said, these are critical for language function. But before I move on to explain the frontal lobe, the lateral fissure, especially in the left hemisphere, this is the left hemisphere, the lateral fissure is the area around which are language production and language processing, like comprehension and production, are all the areas around the temporal fissure are the central hub for the processing of language, spoken, verbal, sign, you name it. And the other areas around then are cognitive areas, and there are areas to connect cognition with language. The frontal lobe begins from the central fissure, and it is anterior, so it is all the part of the brain that is anterior to the central fissure, and it is separated from the temporal cortex by the lateral fissure. So you need to describe in words what, the boundaries of each of these lobes. And then you need to focus on certain landmarks, certain major areas of every lobe that, and their function. So the major landmarks of the frontal lobe, this frontal lobe is your hub for motor activity, motor activation, motor planning. And it's also for emotional processing, for making judgment, for decision making, for working memory, for attention. It has numerous functions. It is what runs your entire brain, your entire body. But let's take different parts of it. So the biggest major landmark is the precentral gyrus. That is the precentral gyrus. And we call this gyrus the motor cortex or the primary motor cortex. It extends from the longitudinal fissure all the way down to the temporal fissure. Then we have the premotor cortex. So premotor, this is the motor cortex function. And the area in front of it, this area, is sometimes called area number 4. It is called the premotor area. So if there's the motor area in front of it, is the premotor area, right there. And in front of the foot of the premotor area or the premotor cortex lies Broca's area, the most important area for speech processing, for motor planning, and for motor production, and for syntax, for grammar. These little gyri, small gyri here. One area here is called 44, one is 45. Together, you put them together like this. That makes Broca's area. And Broca's area is only found inside of the left hemisphere. Even though there is a mirror image of it in the other side, in the right hemisphere, we do not call that area we don't call it Broca. We only call Broca's when the area that is in the left hemisphere. And particularly, where is it? You need to understand, first, how to recognize it on a picture. Second, how to describe it in words. Third, to know Brodmann areas. What numbers does it have on the map? So the numbers are 44, BA, Brodmann area 44, Brodmann area 45. And because the guy who discovered it and that it is responsible for syntax, his name was Paul Broca, we call this Broca's area to this day. So Broca's area lies in in the left hemisphere, in the frontal lobe of the left hemisphere, in the inferior posterior part of the frontal lobe, anterior to the foot of the premotor cortex. Yes, you need to know all these descriptions in minute detail and thorough detail. So exactly, just repeat the video if you want, repeat that segment and describe it the way that I described. Then this segment here of the premotor cortex right here, and the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, all of them continue inside of the longitudinal fissure. So each area comes down and extends into the fissure, like I'm gonna show you. So you could see, for example, here, this is the part of the motor cortex, this is part of the somatosensory cortex, this is part of the premotor area, or the premotor cortex, and so it extends all the way to the cingulate gyrus, all of them. So you look again, is the pre-central the central sulcus, or the Rolandic fissure, or the central fissure, whatever you call it. And here's that red area here, the gyrus, is called the motor cortex, the function of it, and it is also called the precentral gyrus. And the area in front, all this area here, is called the premotor cortex, or the premotor area. The top segment of the premotor area, the top segment here, is called the supplementary motor cortex. Supplementary motor cortex. It is involved in the initiation of speech and in editing speech orders. And here is Broca's area. It's going to be in the inferior, and the left inferior posterior part of the frontal lobe, in front of the foot of the premotor cortex. So Broca's area, let me see. Broca's area is again area 44 and 45, and it is responsible for motor planning, for speech, and it is responsible for the activation of the motor structures for speech, because it contributes to the script. You know, you need, in order to say one word, you need to have the linguistic script. You need to know the sounds of it. You need to know the word habit as one whole unit, and also know the motor map. What organs of speech are needed to produce that word, and each sound in that word. So all of this is rehearsed in Broca's area before you speak, and it sends the information directly to the area, the motor cortex, to activate your muscles of speech. But once it sends Broca's area sends the information, then it becomes quiet, and then the motor cortex activates the muscles. You say something, and then the Broca's area will send additional information. So it sends and it pauses, sends and it pauses. It is not active when you are actually saying the words. It is active in between, because it is what feeds in. So this area, Broca's area, is extensively connected with all kinds of areas here in the prefrontal cortex and in the motor cortex and so on. Then in front of the premotor area And in front of Broca's area, this segment here, the anterior-most part, this area here of the frontal lobe is called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex. So that is the area that is responsible for your decision making, for your self-regulation. For example, to determine when should I talk, when should I stop, what is appropriate, what is not. We know this is against the law, this is not. So being able to make decisions, make judgment, and this area also has working memory skills, it has attention capacities, and it has self-regulation, it gives you awareness, and it connects to the brainstem and other structures as well. It also connects with the hippocampus for memory processing. So it basically is the central driver or the central engine of your entire brain and your entire body, as far as that it helps you run your life on a conscious level. So now here is the longitudinal fissure. You could see now that between the two hemispheres. Now let's go back here, take the motor cortex and the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, these two, and we are gonna kind of separate them and look inside of them. So what we have here is, see, for example, we're looking at this area here, from here to here, and from here, from the longitudinal fissure all the way down on the other side, looking at this sensory cortex, that blue area. Yeah. So this area here is for sensory, and this is the area for motor functions. You see a little person like drawn on each one. This is called the homunculus. Homunculus means little man. I'll go back, help you visualize. So in that picture, it is an imaginary situation, an imaginary kind of figure. It says, it's like having a man sitting on top of the on the superior segment of the motor cortex, and the legs are extended between the two hemispheres. The legs are extended, let me go back here, between the two hemispheres, like this. The legs will be coming down here. So the idea of this is that this area, this is part of the motor cortex that is between the two hemispheres. So this area controls the feet and the ankle, and this area controls the knees here. And then as you go back here, so foot, knee, torso, waist, shoulders, and then from this point on, the rest is basically dedicated to the hand and to the face. So all of this area here, from about here, 2/3 of the whole structure is dedicated to controlling the hands and controlling the face. You can think of this whole little area as the map for motor activation. You can think about it as the switchboard, as every part of your body that you can move, it has a button that activates it and it makes it move. And this way is how it is sequenced, how it is organized, is if you imagine a little man sitting, on the top part of the, say, motor cortex, and dangling his feet in between and leaning back, down this way. So every part that's in the cortex is activates particular parts of his body. So this is a systematic map that goes from the toes all the way down to the head. The same structure is, or a similar structure is found on the other side, on the somatosensory cortex. But the motor cortex gives you movement and movement coordination and so on. But the sensory cortex brings you sensation from the areas that you are moving. So, let me go back here. So this is the sensory homunculus in the same organization, and you go from the toes, foot, ankle, and then torso, and then chest, and then hand. The hand has a big representation because it really does. It's very important to our existence. And then you have the head, and the nose, the lips, and the mouth, and then the tongue, and so all of these structures that have to do with speech. Now go back again. I'm going to show you where they all lie on this map. So here's the tongue and the head and the lips for motor, and the same tongue, lips, and head for sensation. So you move your tongue, you feel it in the somatosensory cortex, and in front of this motor area this is part of the premotor area, or the planning area, motor planning. And in front of that, the lower area of that motor cortex or motor planning area, here you find Broca's area. So Broca's area contributes directly to the planning for speech, whether motor production or stringing words into sentences using grammar, and then sending the information to this area where you activate the organs of speech, and then from there it goes as I explained. So this is called the motor homunculus. This is called the sensory homunculus. These are just imaginary images that are used to represent the map of the motor cortex and how each part of the motor cortex activates a specific part of our body in a systematic way, from feet to the top of your head. And also sensory homunculus is the representation of sensory information as it comes from different parts of the body, from toes all the way down to your head. You could see that the little areas here, that dark area on side of the cerebral cortex, that is the cerebral cortex. That is the little 4 millimeter line margin on top. That is the cerebral cortex, and here it is in dark purple or blue. Now from all these neurons that live in the cerebral cortex, they send down their axons. They send axons. So all of this white space is white matter made out of axons. It's very busy area. These axons make pathways that go down to connect to the lower brain areas, including the brain stem and also the spinal cord. So all of this wiring goes down. This system that you see here connecting from the motor cortex and goes down to the brain stem and the spinal cord, that is called the pyramidal tract or the pyramidal system. All these neurons that when they go from the cerebral cortex to the brain stem and the spinal cord, we call them the upper motor neurons. And the ones that branch out, from these, we call them the lower motor neurons that go down from the spinal cord and connect with the legs and different parts of the body. So so you see here now, here's the medulla oblongata, And this major landmark I explained before, in the inferior segment of the medullary pyramids, we have the pyramidal decussation, where the motor fibers from the right hemisphere cross to the contralateral side of the body, and the motor fibers of the left hemisphere go down, crossover to control the contralateral side of the body. The premotor area lies anterior to the motor cortex, or to the central gyrus. To the precentral gyrus. So some of these of the fibers from the premotor cortex, it lies here. Some of these fibers here go down as part of the pyramidal tract, or the pyramidal pathways. It goes down because you need the planning to go together with the actual motor activation, and there's also even sensory pathways going with that to monitor the movement that is going to be occurring. So the premotor area contributes some fibers to the pyramidal tract, and it is very important for motor planning. Before you speak, you have to construct, your brain will construct a linguistic script of what you're going to say, and it will construct a map for your motor activity that you are going to produce, and it integrates the motor with the linguistic, and it rehearses it multiple times before you actually activate your muscles of speech. So the premotor area contributes to the motor planning and contributes to the activation of movement, and it is also there is a pathway, a major pathway between the premotor area and the parietal cortex. The parietal cortex has to do with space and spatial processing and your sensations that you get from all your body. So there are pathways here that connect with the premotor cortex to help in constructing the spatial motor map, so that your muscles will move in a certain space and move in a certain direction, and you have to have this map before you begin activation of the muscles. So in addition, the premotor cortex, it serves as a storage site for movements that you do. So this way, the movements that you learn how to make are stored in that area, so that you do not have to relearn them. You just only build upon them to improve your performance. So these are major functions here of the premotor cortex. I needed to know where it is, to know exactly what it does, and to know that the Broca's area lies anterior to the foot of the premotor area or the premotor cortex. So here is the motor cortex here. It is not highlighted. The area in blue and in purple, this is the premotor cortex. And the area that has all these arrows, that is Broca's area. It just shows you how it sends information to the planning areas and to the premotor area. So the supplementary motor cortex, you can see it extending between the two hemispheres. You can also see here the motor area extending. So the supplementary motor cortex, or the supplementary motor area, lies, it is, in some cases it's considered part of the premotor cortex. In some cases it is considered like as an individual area, but it doesn't matter to us. Know it as the supplementary motor area. Know that it lies on the on the superior segment of the premotor area, and it is continued between the two hemispheres. It contributes to motor planning. It contributes to editing of movement before you perform it, and also it contributes to generating the script for movement and for linguistic planning. You could see the cingulate gyrus lies, as we described it before, the cingulate gyrus is between the two hemispheres, and the central pieces of the cingulate gyrus, there are two areas here that work with the motor planning and the motor areas. So the frontal lobe in general, just to in terms of the functions, has motor functions, planning or motor planning functions. It has cognitive functions. It is a very busy area. The anterior part of the frontal lobe or the frontal cortex, up like about here, like this area here, that is called the prefrontal cortex, and it is responsible for a ton of neurocognitive functions, neurobehavioral functions, and regulation of your sensory, or regulation of your vision, regulation of your emotions, and so on. So it's responsible for alertness and awareness, and in that case it works with the brain stem, with the reticular formation that I discussed before. And together they give you your conscious awareness, where you are aware of who you are, and as long as all your life, you feel like your life is like a continuous stream together. It facilitates attention, emotional regulation, control over emotions. For example, there's a pathway, two pathways, one between the prefrontal cortex and the emotional system, the amygdala, and the emotional processing system. In childhood, about 5 or 6 years of age, the pathway from the amygdala extends to the prefrontal cortex. Why? It conveys to it the emotions that the person feels. And then the prefrontal cortex then is a decision maker to say, what do I do? I feel sad. What do I do? I feel happy. What do I do? But it is not yet, 4 or 5 years, 5 or 6 years of age, that extension from the amygdala goes up, extends to go to the prefrontal cortex, to convey information about emotions. But then the person has no control over emotions. Kids tantrum and they go through a lot of, they are not accepting things, and they are not using their mind to control their feelings and anger and this and that. But then 14 years or 15 years, when the person reaches puberty, about 14 or 15, then you have a pathway originating in the prefrontal cortex, extending down to the amygdala, and now it allows control over emotions. This is why only 14 or 15 years of age, the person has control over emotions and will be able to, I feel angry. No, I should be balanced. I should control myself. This is not the situation to tantrum, or the situation to show myself as this or that. So this is just an example of emotional regulation, but it works with other areas. Inhibitory control, it means you want to do something, but you stop yourself, from doing it. You want to have a cookie now? No, it's not good. I haven't had my lunch, this, that. So inhibiting verbal behavior, inhibiting movement, and inhibiting any kind of behavior, having control over your behavior. But it contributes to your motivation and the regulation of motivation. Problem solving, judgment, and decision making. Social communication, in terms of what is appropriate to say, when is it appropriate to say it, is this the context where I should say this joke, should I interrupt now because this is an emergency, or should I wait because this is not an emergency? So it enables you basically to look at the person and build a theory. It helps construct a theory of mind about the person. But in that case, it works with the parietal lobe to construct that theory of mind. Social, again, integration of language and cognitive abilities. So you see something, for example, you know what it is used for, and so all of these functions and many more, but these are overall the basic functions of the prefrontal cortex. Now let's look more in depth at Broca's area. Broca's area, again, you need to know exactly, precisely where it is and what areas, and with every little detail that you need to know this critical area. So it is found in the left hemisphere, in the frontal lobe, in the inferior posterior part of the frontal lobe, anterior to the foot of the premotor cortex. You say that, you get all the points. Now the functions. It is responsible for motor planning and motor activation. It is responsible for syntax and processing of syntax, helping you string words into sentences, to make sentences. And it is so grammatical processing or syntactic processing, motor planning, and motor activation. It also contributes to the rehearsal of the linguistic script. Before you say something, your frontal part of the frontal lobe, working with other areas and working with the temporal cortex, establishes, makes a script of what you will say. Just think about yourself going to place an order at a takeout place, or say at a window. What do you go through before you place the order? You yourself even think, oh, I should get this and this and that, and you rehearse and rehearse, but your brain does this automatically for you as you speak, so that by the microsecond, so that as you speak, your stream of speech doesn't get interrupted. So your ideas are being retrieved and put into linguistic forms, and in a way that is systematic. So that script, you have to make a script before you talk, and that is Broca's area is part of that process. Wernicke's area and the temporal lobe is part of that process as well. So it contributes to language comprehension as well, and it contributes to the rehearsal of speech motor commands. It also contributes to phonological memory. There are pathways that connect it to the temporal cortex, particularly to the primary auditory cortex and to Wernicke's area. And that one pathway goes out of there and goes to Broca's, and it makes part of what is known as the arcuate fasciculus, the pathway that is arched like an arch. And another branch goes to the premotor area, planning area for speech. So these two pathways are dedicated to motor planning and motor activation for speech. And another pathway that goes underneath is called the ventral pathway, goes down and goes to the anterior, to the frontal lobe. It goes to the second area of Broca's area, and it is responsible for phonological processing. So these are called the dorsal and ventral language streams, but I want you to know that Wernicke's area here, I will discuss it in more detail, is connected with Broca's areas via the arcuate fasciculus. That's an important landmark, an important pathway. So now we discussed the main landmarks of the frontal cortex. Now we speak about the temporal cortex, and the temporal cortex consists of three gyri: the superior temporal gyrus, the medial or the middle temporal gyrus, the inferior temporal gyrus. That area is particularly critical for language comprehension, and it is critical for memory processing and auditory processing. Behind this area where the frog is, this area that you see on the surface is called the auditory association cortex, for integration of auditory signals, and it helps us connect words with their meaning. On the inside, behind this wall, in the middle temporal lobe, you're going to find that little structure that we know as the hippocampus, that is for memory processing. So these two areas, the auditory association area and the hippocampus, work together to help you recognize the meaning of the words that you hear. And from there, these are sent to Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area shares these words with Broca's area, and then they go back and forth exchanging information so that you know what the word is. Is it a noun? Is it a verb? Where should you place it in the sentence? And then, does this sound right? Does it not sound? And so on. So the major landmarks of the temporal lobe or cortex is the primary motor cortex, which lies, now know exactly these details. These are critical communication details. The primary auditory cortex is the area that is responsible for processing of auditory signals. And it lies in the middle superior temporal gyrus, that pinkish area here. And it is made up of two areas. One area is called Brodmann area 41 and Brodmann area 42. These two areas. And on the same temporal gyrus, the superior temporal gyrus, the posterior segment of the superior temporal gyrus behind the primary auditory cortex, that is called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is Brodmann area number 22, and it's only found in the left hemisphere. What are the functions? It recognizes speech. It assembles phonemes, single sounds, into syllables and words, and it works with the primary auditory cortex. It works with the auditory association cortex. This one, auditory association cortex, that's called area number 21. They work together in order to match the sounds of a word with the meaning of the word. So you have the word frog. What does that mean? It consists of the sounds f, r, a, g. And then you assemble the, frog. What is a frog? And you send the information to the auditory association cortex in that area. And then the auditory association cortex communicates with the hippocampus to get the meaning. And it tells you, frog is an animal that does this and this and this and that. You integrate that, and then you send the information from Wernicke's area out to Broca's area, and one copy goes to the premotor area so that you plan on how to say the word that you have heard. Wernicke's area is critical for associating sounds with their meanings, words with their meanings, for assembling phonemes into individual words, for oral expression, because before you say something, you need to rehearse it, and in order to rehearse it, you have to go to Wernicke's area. For monitoring your own voice and for monitoring your own verbal output. Am I sequencing the phonemes correctly? Am I putting them in the right place? And then also for comprehending what someone is saying. Even if you are reading something, it is comprehended in this area. Again, keep in mind, know the location, be able to identify it on a picture. Know that the major pathway that connects Wernicke's area with Broca's area is called the arcuate fasciculus. Arcuate fasciculus. And that fasciculus is a two-way street. Wernicke's area sends information to Broca's. Broca sends back information to Wernicke's, and they exchange information that they have so that you can receive a message, and you can also give a message or reply to it, because that requires integration of auditory and verbal functions. If someone has damage in this area, they have Wernicke's aphasia. If they have damage in Broca's area, we call this Broca's aphasia. The parietal lobe or the parietal cortex, that area here, is responsible for somatosensory, like for sensation. All kinds of sensation from your body is processed in the parietal lobe. And it also processes spatial aspects of the environment. Say, for example, my hand, it's moving. Where is it moving? The space that it is moving in, the angle, the way, the direction of the movement, and so on. So it gives you information about the structures or the organs and how they are oriented in space, the direction of their movement, the extent of their movement, and so on. It is the area that enables you to locate your car in a garage or in a busy area. For example, you need to think and follow a map and reverse directions and so on. That is the area that allows you to do that. The whole cortex. Now, we said that the line between the pink line here, between the motor cortex or the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus, that is the central sulcus or central fissure. That gyrus that lies posterior to the central fissure, that is called the somatosensory cortex. But now go back to the central fissure. The central fissure divides or separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe begins at the central fissure and continues to the line that is the parieto-occipital sulcus. That is one. And it also extends from the longitudinal fissure down to the boundaries of the temporal lobe and the visual cortex. The major landmark in this gyrus and this lobe is the post-central gyrus. This map that I showed you here, that is the sensory homunculus, and every segment of the gyrus, the somatosensory gyrus, gives you sensation from one particular part of your body. So the feet are the parts that are dedicated to the toes and the feet are in between, buried within the longitudinal fissure. And then as you go back again, the person is like a person lying on his back all the way down. And then you can see that a big part is dedicated to the hand, and a big part to the face, a big part to the tongue and the lips. So again, here you get the motor activity, and here you get the sensation about the movement and any sensation from that organ. General functions of the parietal lobe. It helps you locate objects and also manipulate objects. Like, for example, I do an experiment in the class sometimes where you say, close your eyes, open your hand, I'm going to put something in your hand. If you put something in your hand like this, there is no way that you know what it is that you are holding. Yes, you can feel it's a piece of metal because of the cold, but it may be a piece of ice. So what helps you, if I say to you, do not use your fingertips, you will not be able to identify this, because the areas that have sensory maps or detectors, receptors, are the fingertips. So immediately if you go with your fingertips, oh, it's a piece of this or this, it's a penny, it's a quarter. With your fingertips, each one has a sensory center that you can use to read information and collect information about the texture, about the size, about the thickness, whatever it is. But these are the areas that can help you read that. And the information is sent to your brain using, and then finally goes to the parietal cortex, and then you'll be able to recognize what you are touching. So that is what we know as touch perception. Goal-directed voluntary movements. It contributes to the manipulation of objects, again, to be able to hold something and kind of, shape it in different ways with your hands, or twist it, or package it, and so on. Integration of different senses that allows for understanding of a single concept. So it enables you to integrate the small pieces of information about one object or one thing, and then into one complete whole. So ability to attend to more than one object at the same time, that is sometimes called dual attention, or actually also part of work and memory processing. Naming objects, that is also a function of the parietal lobe. And remember, parietal lobe, remember that the biggest landmark it has is the post-central gyrus. What does that gyrus do? It has the map of sensation for all your body. That is called the sensory homunculus. The parietal lobe enables you to locate words while you are reading and writing, for example. As you just look and you identify certain words, you want to look for a particular thing, you can just scan the page and find it. Ability to draw objects, because it has spatial processing abilities, and it helps you with processing directions in space, like driving and reversing directions, being aware of certain body parts, and also surrounding space. For example, a surgeon once said that he was in a hospital, and a man said to him, these people, he was complaining about the food, that the food was not being, they didn't give him a snack. So, and then he was also complaining that the guy next to him was always putting his arm on him and bothering him. He was totally unaware that this arm that he thought belonged to the neighbor, to the other person in the other bed, he was totally unaware that this is his own arm that is paralyzed. So when the nurses would come in and would find that arm hanging down, out of the bed, they lift it up and put it on his chest, and then he wakes up. Whose arm is this? And he takes it and flicks it, and he throws it away down. And so that is because of abnormalities in that lobe, and he was not able to recognize that arm as his own arm. The ability to focus visual attention and eye-hand coordination. Like, how do you use your hand to reach, for example, your mouth, or to use your hand to touch some, particular parts? Is your hand accurate? Is your movement accurate? Touch your nose, touch your eye, touch this, that is eye-hand coordination. The primary visual cortex, we don't spend too much on it. It is the center for processing visual perception, and it is located, of course, in the posterior to the temporal lobe and inferior to the parietal cortex, and it is responsible for storage and processing of visual stimuli, and it contributes to higher level of visual processing, like the depth of something, perception of color, perception of distance. For example, you see when you look at something moving away, it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. Something coming to you, it becomes bigger and bigger. That is what we mean by higher level visual processing. And of course, reading, because you need your eyes, you need to scan things vertically, and you need to scan things horizontally. Now we look at the cranial nerves, and a lot of them are visual. So, and we are going to focus a lot on the ones that are that we use for language and communication. So the first one is, these are lined up. If you split this, go down, you're going to have a right side and the left side. The right side is identical to the left side. So here you have cranial nerve 1, cranial nerve 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. But they are organized only using Latin numerals, and organized from the very top to the lowest one, from 1 to 12. With the first one being the olfactory, which has to do with smell, and the 12, it has to do with the tongue. That's called the hypoglossal nerve. And remember, the only reason we call them cranial is that their roots on the spine, on the brain stem, their roots are inside of the skull. That is the only reason. And then each one is going to exit out of the skull to control different structures. So the optic nerve, optic nerve number 2, has to do with vision and visual acuity, the eye lens basically. And the third one is motor. It controls reaction to light, and it moves the eyelids, and it moves the eyes up and down for vertical scanning, visual tracking, fixation, light reflexes. Like when someone shines light onto your eyes, the pupil should constrict. And if it doesn't, then there's something wrong. Either the person is drunk, or has a neural, like the nerve is damaged, or maybe the person is sexually aroused. That causes dilation of the pupils. And then the trochlear nerve number 4, cranial nerve 4, that is for downward and lateral movement of the eyes. Number 6 is the abducens, which is for lateral eye movements. So we only just basically know this just in the most general terms. We are going to focus a lot on this. From this point on, you need to know the details. And you should go to your textbook to find out more details. Cranial nerves, cranial nerve 5, and then to the end. So 5, and then 7, and from 7 to all the way to 12. So cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal. Tri means 3. Geminis means twin. So you have one side here, and now each one has a twin. Tri means 3. So the one that has 3 twins. But each side works independently from the other. Of course, like in other words, if one is paralyzed, the other one may not be. So trigeminal, this one has 3 branches. One goes to the forehead and around the eyes and the nose. This is one. The other one goes to the maxilla, and the other one goes to the jaw. So these three, see, we have ophthalmic, that has to do with the eyes and the forehead and nose, and then we have the maxillary branch, this one, and we have the mandibular branch. That mandibular branch is the one that is numbed when you go to have your teeth done. So when we look at nerves, we describe them in terms, is this nerve sensory? Sensory doesn't move things. It just gets sensation from the structure and sends it up. Motor, it moves things. There are nerves that have both sensory and motor. They have branches, sensory branch, motor branch. And there are ones that have mixed. It means they have sensory, they have motor, and they have also some have autonomic or autonomous. It means autonomic functions as well. So the functional divisions of the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, number 1, it is both sensory and motor. Sensory, it carries information from cutaneous, means on the skin, from the and proprioception from the skin and the muscles and the joints of the face and the mouth, exclusively face, mouth, muscles, and the joints, like your temporomandibular joint, for example, the joints, any joints that you have, in this, like inside, for example. So it is sensory. It provides sensory innervation for the teeth and jaw. It feels, it sends the information from there, so you can feel pain and so on, or pressure. The motor functions of it activates muscles of mastication, muscles of chewing, and that rotate and elevate the mandible. So that is the motor function. So it contributes to swallowing functions, and it also has sensory functions that I've just explained. Damage to this nerve is going to cause decreased sensitivity or numbness on the face. For example, some people have trigeminal neuralgia. They might have severe attacks on the face, for example, because of this nerve. They're called trigeminal neuralgia. So also someone might have weakness or wasting of the jaw. If they are not receiving innervation, the jaw will be weak, and it will start to atrophy. Asymmetrical chewing. Asymmetrical because usually one side becomes impaired, and then the jaw is going to deviate. So when the person tries to chew, they are not going to be able to rotate the jaw, to crush the food and prepare it. So again, recall, a nerve can be sensory, or it can be motor, or it can be both. Or it can be sensory, motor, and it will have an autonomic branch as well that controls things that you do not have control over. So the cranial nerve number 7, that's called the facial nerve, and that's a mixed nerve. It has the sensory branch, so you can look at it here. For example, special sensory is the green. General sensory is the blue around your ear canal, for example. Branchial motor is the yellow, and the orange here is the visceral motor. So it has different branches, but the sensory gives you sensation from the skin of the external ear canal here, and also taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So that is the sensory. For motor, it activates muscles of the facial expression, and for example, it activates also the stylohyoid, the stapedius muscle that gives you, that is the muscle for the acoustic reflex. When you hear a very loud sound, it gives you like a little pinch because of the loudness of the sound. Also the posterior belly of the digastric. So you need to know all these muscles that are activated by each nerve. Autonomic branch of it activates the salivary glands that produce saliva in the mouth, lacrimal glands that produce tears in the eyes, and blood vessels of the cerebral cortex. The blood vessels need to constantly regulate their pressure. They are gonna dilate or expand to lower pressure. They will constrict to raise pressure. So this facial nerve sends branches into these blood vessels that are inside of your cerebral cortex to regulate the level of pressure that you have. Damage to the cranial or the facial nerve causes what is known as Bell's palsy. And by the way, you see the parotid gland here for saliva, and you see the submandibular gland and sublingual gland. All of these three glands produce saliva while you are chewing, so that you mix your saliva with your food. So the facial nerve, damage to it causes Bell's palsy, and that is characterized by kind of paralysis on one side of the face. When you look at this face first, now I'll give you a few seconds to tell me which side is paralyzed. Is it left side or right side? So now I hope you got the answer for yourself. So the right side of this man's right side is the weaker side. Why? Because it is pulled, it is lax. The other side here, his left side, is contracted normally. You can see the wrinkles on the forehead. That is normal functioning. You can see his cheek and the side of, say, his nose near. It is rounded and closed. You can see this basically, his left side is intact and actually is pulling on his right side. So that lax, flaccid side of the right side, you can see the eyebrow, how it is drooping down because it cannot contract, because all this side of the facial nerve is paralyzed, while the other side is contracted normally, and you can see the difference. So the person will have a dry cornea. Why? Because the lacrimal gland cannot be activated. It doesn't have nerve input. So the person will have a dry eye. Inability to close eyes during blinking causes sound to also, in addition to that, this is Bell's palsy. But another problem is the stapedius muscle will not get innervation, and it will make the three bones in the middle ear kind of loose. So when they vibrate, they go slowly, and the sound is gonna be booming because of the stapedius muscle that anchors the stapes and holds it in place, and also kind of gives some stability. It is loose. It doesn't contract, and the person's you hear voices as having a booming quality to them. The vestibulocochlear nerve, that is made out of the cochlear branch and the vestibular branch of the inner ear, and together they are combined as they exit and go to the brain stem. They combine into the vestibulocochlear nerve, and that is